Hello, everyone. We are going to get started back here in just a moment. I just wanted to remind all of our Loyola law students that if you want your skills credit, you need to email your 300-word reflection to Professor Hector Linares. He's the skills professor. And again, if you want CLE credit, you need to email me. I will drop my email in the chat. My name is Malia Serrato. I'm the symposium editor of the Loyola Law Review, and we are very excited to have you here. Our next session is going to be all about education. As a former educator myself, I'm very excited to hear some of our amazing speakers. And I'm going to let Professor Robert Garda, our moderator for this session, introduce everyone.
I am so excited for this panel. I cannot tell you. I mean, Malia knows. I'm excited for the topic, and I'm excited for who we got. I can't believe you guys brought the NBA All-Stars in, essentially. Like, way to go. So here's why I'm really excited for the topic. It's structural racism in education in light of COVID, right? So we've been through this in New Orleans. Obviously, a pandemic is different than a hurricane, but there's a lot of similarities that we saw in 2005 and in the aftermath. I mean, first of all, the upheaval in education. Katrina, still in the middle of the upheaval, honestly, and the pandemic, obviously, as well. Second is, it has shined a light truly on the inequities, and that's inequities that existed pre-Katrina and pre-pandemic and in our reaction to the pandemic and to Katrina. And the third similarity in my mind has been sort of everyone wondering what the permanent impact on education may be, and will it be good or bad, essentially. So that's enough from me, right? I just think that this is, I know it's a national topic, an international topic, but boy, it just harkens back to a lot of memories from Katrina for me. So I'm going to introduce our panel. You can read their bios. They're incredible. I'm just going to add a couple of personal touches here and there. I mean, Dr. Perry is a Brookings Fellow. If you've watched TV or read the newspaper, you've seen him and read him. He's just got an incredible number of reports. And Andre, I got to say, my favorite thing you've been talking about is the unrealized value of teachers that the pandemic's brought to us. My wife is a teacher, and I shared that information with her, and she was like, cheers. So that was fantastic. The other thing I really want to highlight about Dr. Perry is his service to Louisiana. That's incredible what he has done for this state and this city. He was here for a long time and moved on to bigger and better things, but he was invaluable in our post-Katrina response, essentially. And the last thing I want to mention about Dr. Perry, and he'll never remember this, I remember sitting in his office at UNO. I was brand new to New Orleans. And boy, did he give me an incredible education. I walked out of that with two thoughts. Like, first of all, wow, I really need to change my thinking about education. I need to be a lot broader in my thinking process. And second, that guy's going to be famous. I was right about both. Then we're going to hear from Professor Robinson, a professor at UVA. Here's the thing about, like, you can see how incredible she is in her bio. She thinks big. She does not tinker around the edges. She doesn't identify small problems and have small solutions. It is all about radically reconstructing education system, especially when it comes to the federal and state role. Like, she is the go-to expert essentially on Rodriguez and national, where sort of the national and state intersection is in terms of controlling education. My personal story about Kimberly is, I remember we were at a conference. We had spent a couple days together and seen her present and met her. And I was talking with Derek Black at the end of it. Derek Black's another incredible education law scholar. And I turned to Derek and said, man, she's brilliant and articulate and interesting. I wish I could be that. And he said, join the club. Kimberly, you know, that's exactly what Derek would say, right? The glib, just join the club. And finally, we're going to hear from Professor Moran, a founding member at UCI, Irvine. Rachel, we only met each other once a long time ago, and you would never remember. But what's great about Professor Moran is that she's involved in every aspect of education, like every level, primary, secondary, graduate, undergraduate. Like if it's existed in education, she's written and thought about it. I think she's also served on every relevant panel. Not panel, I'm sorry. On every relevant organization, ABA, AALS, local and national think tanks. I mean, I don't know where you find the time, Professor Moran. It's fantastic. I have followed Professor Moran from afar because she's sort of the go-to scholar on Latinx issues and on higher ed and affirmative action and thinking largely about the entire system from cradle to graduate school. So it's a great broad-based perspective. All right, enough from me. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Perry.
Hello, everyone. I'm Andre Perry. I'm a scholar here at the Brookings Institution, where I study Black majority cities. And I'm actually going to do just a very brief presentation for you today. Just gives you a little bit of highlight of my work and what I'm working on as it pertains to education. So just bear with me as I try to share my screen. Hopefully everyone can see it. Give me a thumbs up if you can see it, Robert. Oh, very good. Worthy of investment, restoring value to Black communities. Now, a lot of people say, oh, by the way, a lot of this information can be found in my new book, Know Your Price, Valuing Black Lives and Property in America's Black Cities, wherever available, wherever fine books are sold. I study Black majority cities and neighborhoods, but there are too many neighborhoods to put on a map. So here you have the Black majority cities in the United States. There are more than 1,200 of them. This is where I grew up. This is 1320 Hill Avenue, Wilkinsburg, Pennsylvania. Wilkinsburg is a small municipality surrounded by Pittsburgh on 3 sides. As you can see, the house is boarded up. It's been abandoned. You can pick it up essentially for by agreeing to pay the property taxes on it, but it's worth so much more to me. That woman up in the upper right-hand corner, that's Elsie Boyd. I called her mom. As the story was told to me when I was born, she made a deal with my maternal grandmother that she would take me in. And that's what she did. My mother was poor. She already had a child when she was 15, had me when she was 17. She was probably abused. And so mom did what a lot of matriarchs did in that area. A lot of matriarchs do. She took in kids. One of the reasons why this young man, Floyd Criswell, was my father. He was a heroin addict, and he was in and out of prison. In which, and that's where a lot of my research began. I started to look at all the conditions in which he lived. And as you can see here, I'm not going to save the history lesson, but he lived in areas that were red line, that, where the Homeowners Loan Corporation designated Black majority neighborhoods not worthy of investment. He lived in areas like in New Orleans where highway construction barreled through Black communities. He also lived in areas where there was urban renewal, which literally bulldozed many aspects of the Black community, never to be built up again. He was in areas where there was a lot of predatory lending. Specifically, he lived in areas where there were a lot of rent-to-own schemes that were predatory in nature. And he lived around areas in which there were lots of restrictive housing covenants. So he could not move out of those places largely. And then I should say my father and the person who raised me all lived in these kind of situations. But I wanted to put it in today's context, so I started looking at home prices in those areas. And on this chart, you can see on that x-axis, that's the percentage of Black people in a zip code. On the y-axis is indicated a price. That's the average price of homes in those zip codes. So in areas where the share of the Black population is less than 1%, those places, homes are on average priced about $340,000. That's the median Zillow price, and then you have about $306, the median census price. But as you can see, it's pretty linear. As the neighborhoods get blacker, the home prices go down. Now, now a lot of people say that's because of education, that's because of crime, but those are things you can control for in a study. And that's what we did. We looked at the absolute price difference, but we controlled for structural characteristics and neighborhood amenities. So we wanted to get an apples to apples comparison of homes in Black neighborhoods and white neighborhoods. So again, education, crime, walkability, all those fancy Zillow metrics we control for. And what we found is homes in Black neighborhoods are underpriced by 23%, about $48,000 per home. Cumulatively, there's about $156 billion in lost equity. This is occurring all over the United States. Wherever you see a magenta circle, that's where devaluation is occurring. Detroit, for instance, 37%, about $28,000 per home. This is occurring, like I said, all over the country. In Lynchburg, Virginia, 81% difference, 81%. Rochester, New York, 65% difference. Again, if you helicoptered a home in a Black neighborhood and put it in a white neighborhood, it would increase in value by 81%. There are places where homes in Black neighborhoods are priced higher. Wichita, Boston, but Boston's no less racist than Lynchburg, but the home prices are higher. But I say all that to get to that. I'm getting to the point in education, 156 billion. Remember, education is largely funded by property taxes based upon the assessed value of homes. And so wherever you see devaluation, you're seeing less revenue for schools. In addition to that, I just want to put this in perspective. It would have financed more than that 156 billion would have financed more than 4 million Black-owned businesses. It would have paid for more than 8 million four-year degrees, replaced the pipes in Flint, Michigan 3,000 times over, covered almost all of Hurricane Katrina damage, and just doubled the annual economic burden of the opioid crisis. The last bullet is important. The last two are important for me in a lot of respects. When you're talking about Katrina, that extraction of wealth is occurring every day. Every day there's every year there's a hurricane in our midst. In addition, my father died of a heroin addiction. If he lived in white areas, he would have had better schools, better opportunity to go to college, greater opportunity to start a business. His life would have been different. This is why I say all the time that there's nothing wrong with Black people that ending racism can't solve. That whenever we say something's wrong with Black schools, Black people, Black neighborhoods, we always point to individual failures, not policy failures, not structural issues. In addition, kids don't live in schools, they live in communities. Too often I heard people say, if we could only fix the school, everything will be all right. That's not true. That schools are part of systems that are regularly extracting wealth from Black communities. In closing, I just want to show this brief clip of Representative Al Green. And this will show you the level of denial of discrimination in our country. Now, if there's anything that we know is that there is discrimination in housing. We have tons of it, tons of data on research on this. Listen to this exchange of me with the appraisal community on this very issue.
If you think Black people are being discriminated when their property is being appraised, would you kindly raise your hand? One person on the panel. If you think that, for fear that I'm not communicating well, if you think that Black people are not being discriminated against when their property is being appraised, if you think they're not being discriminated against, kindly raise your hand. Okay, hands now, we're getting some consternation, I see.
So I wanted to present that to you because I do a lot of work on housing, I do a lot of work on business, a lot of work with education. My point here is that we need to look at things structurally. That if you don't look at underlying conditions, you are forced to blame Black people, Black teachers, Black organizations, school boards, and not address the underlying causes for many of the problems that we see. Thank you very much. Oh, I think you're muted.
Yes. All right. That was a compelling presentation. I'm excited to just build on those important points. So,
Professor Robinson, do you mind if I interrupt really briefly?
Sure.
I really want to exercise my moderator's prerogative and interrupt with some questions, because first of all, that was you, Dr. Perry, raising your hand, right? At that meeting in your video clip?
Oh, yeah, that was me. I'm
okay,
sorry.
just making sure. You're the only one in the room. Can you speak just a tiny bit more, and this really fascinated me, because there's such a narrative that education can solve everything. And if we just funded it equitably, and states are trying very hard to fund equitable education by giving more money to the schools. You mentioned it really quickly, but if you could just expand a little bit on the sort of education as panacea and solution for all, and just equitable funding of education being the primary solution that a lot of people follow.
Yeah, one of the, and I realized this as a former school leader. Now, I did not say this. I was a charter leader in New Orleans. And so often people would say that if we could only fix schools, but then I quickly saw how they were using that trope to essentially fire Black teachers, to who they essentially said were the problem. And it is an abdication of looking at the deeper wealth extraction in our policies and on our system. I like to think, we all like to think that education is the great equalizer. Horace Mann said some version of that people always point to. But in reality, wealth is more of an equalizer than anything else. That when people have wealth, they get better schools, they have greater opportunity. And so when you don't look at what's causing wealth divides, and by the way, housing is a big part of it, segregation is a big part of it, then you're really not trying to solve for education, because education doesn't predict for wealth, wealth predicts for education. And so that's why I constantly push back on this notion that education is the great equalizer, and if we just solve for this, then all these other things will go away. No, they won't. We will always have disparities in our educational system if we don't correct for these sort of structural problems that are at work, whether we reform schools or not.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Professor Robinson. I just had to ask that. So go ahead, please.
No problem. All right. So I am going to first just sketch out some data about the scope of the educational opportunity gap. So it's important, I think, to understand three things. One, that we have an educational opportunity gap that's driving our achievement gap. There's all this news and press, test scores come out, but there's so much less talked about the disparities in educational opportunity that are driven in significant part by what Dr. Perry just shared. So we have a large opportunity gap. We have a series of federal laws and court decisions that have failed to dismantle Jim Crow and the legacy of slavery in our schools. And then finally, I'm going to end with what we should do about all of that. So let me just start with a point that really actually dovetails beautifully with what Dr. Perry just said. So notice that he was the only one who was aware that when homes are appraised in African-American neighborhoods, that there's discrimination happening, right? Same thing happens in education. So a survey, Pathways in Education did a survey and said, do you feel that students of color are afforded the same educational opportunities as their peers? 81% of white parents said, yeah, absolutely. Yes, they are. 43 African-Americans had a very different view. 43% said, agreed, yes. So well less than half. And then 72% of Hispanics actually said yes, which was the number actually I was most surprised about. But what's concerning about that is that tells us that there's a lack of understanding of the fact that we are dividing, giving educational opportunities very differently based on race and based on color. And so because of that, because we don't have an awareness about it, we're not doing anything about it. We're not really seeking to dismantle structural racism, the focus of the conference, because people aren't really aware that this is doing a whole lot of work in education and in distributing educational opportunities. So I'll give you some figures that really confirm that. EdBuild confirmed in a recent report that there's a $23 billion gap between white, 75% or more white student districts and non-white districts that educate the same number of children, 23 billion. I think it's really important to let that sink in. There's a huge gap in funding, and that funding translates in so many concrete and tangible ways, whether it's which teachers you can hire, that have, temperatures that are you're not able to learn it, whether it's very hot or very cold, a lack of technology, a lack of materials. EdTrust confirms a significant disparity. So if you look at the districts that serve the highest number of students of color, they have 1,800 less per pupil, or about 13% less from districts that do not have the highest numbers of students of color. And when you take 1,800 per pupil, you multiply that in a classroom, you multiply that in a school, and then you multiply that between districts, you can see that these two numbers really tell a story of our systematic and wholesale underinvestment in schools for many, many children of color. The other thing that we are also doing poorly is we are not addressing what research says must happen to help children who live in concentrated poverty to succeed. So children in concentrated poverty bring to the classroom an entire host of challenges that you have to address if you're going to help them be ready to learn. And so that can be anything from unstable housing, homelessness, trauma in the home, unemployment. There's just a food insecurity. It's a whole host of things. And so the research is compelling, and scholars agree that you have to invest more in children of poverty than you do children living in poverty than other children for them to compete on a level playing field with their peers. What do the states do in light of that evidence? 15 states give, the most recent report from Education Law Center says 15 states actually give less funding to these kids, less funding. 17 give about the same, and 16 states give at least 5% more. Now, the trick with that is you might think, well, 16 states, those are doing the right thing. 5%, there is not agreement among scholars about what the amount should be, but nobody thinks it should be as little as 5%. So even that number overstates what should be happening in terms of driving more resources to students in concentrated poverty than in other districts. The other thing is the United States is an outlier on this. We are not consistent with other nations. Other nations do drive additional resources to children in concentrated poverty. We are we are an outlier on that, and we're paying for it every year with the underprepared children who are not reaching their full potential, and we are losing out on their investment in our political landscape. We're losing out on their economic investment. We're losing out on, the child that we underinvested in could have been the one who helped us to get a vaccine quicker, could have helped prevent this whole pandemic from starting. We're underinvestigating in millions of children every year. And so the challenge, of course, is if you look at the data about other challenges that we are experiencing in our schools, you have a number of other phenomena that are disadvantaging children of color in particular. So, for example, Black students are four times as likely as white students to be suspended or expelled. Almost 1 in 5 African-American boys is suspended, as 1 in 10 African-American girls are suspended. Much lower number for whites, 5% or 1 in 20, and 2% for white girls, right? But you have this large gap in who we're pushing out of the classroom, who we're pushing into the school to prison pipeline. Same thing with other disparities also exist in a number of things, including access to gifted and talented programs and AP classes, and then also who gets the most experienced teachers. So minority students are more likely to have inexperienced, uncertified, teaching out of field teachers in their classroom than other children. And so the challenge is sort of, how did we get there? And there's an array of federal law and policy that helped us get here, and that we have to address if we're going to look at remedies for what to do. So it's important to understand sort of three different, there's many, but I'm just going to talk about three because there's time limits on how long we're talking, but three different areas that you want to understand for how we got here: school desegregation law and policy, school funding, and then federal education policy, particularly the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. So how did they contribute to what we have today? So first, in school desegregation law and policy, the big challenge is when slavery was ended and we went through Reconstruction, we were building schools, we were encouraging people to attend public school. The public school movement really took off. We developed common schools. We had to move to eventually universal public education. The challenge is, of course, is that Jim Crow sought to systematically disadvantage Black and Brown children in schools. So complete underinvestment in facilities, teachers, materials, everything. The challenge, unfortunately, and Jim Crow was determined, it was comprehensive, it was whole scale, it was at every level of life, but in schools, it affected everything from teacher salaries to school funding to what was in the classroom and what the buildings looked like. Then we had school desegregation, and there's this thing that school children are taught, which is Brown versus Board of Education desegregated our schools. Did it? I mean, what it said is separate schools are inherently unequal, but unfortunately, the court blinked. The courts, did not demand an effective remedy for that segregation. And so because of that, because it invited school districts to act with all deliberate speed, those who are opposed to desegregation took that as an invitation to engage in massive resistance. And so there was this widespread effort to resist by every means necessary integrating the schools. And the Supreme Court finally decided to step in a 1968 case called in Green, the court versus New Kent County Public Schools. The court eventually did demand that you had to desegregate and desegregate now, and named a number of factors that you had to look at to measure desegregation, faculty, student assignments, extracurricular activities, all of those things. The problem is there had already been a massive shift in demographics of where people were living, right? So people saw desegregation coming and they voted with their feet. So one of the things that coincides with this time is this increase in the suburbs, the movement around of people to avoid school segregation, big increase in private schools, white flight academies just started springing up and to take children for whose families they did not want to attend integrated schools. And so the court did issue, Green, and then another decision out of Charlotte-Mecklenburg, the Swan decision, which sanctioned busing and other mechanisms to address this. The problem is you already had a large shift in where people were living, such that integration was already harder. And then the court issued the Milliken decision. And Milliken is responsible for much of the school desegregation litigation we have today, in addition to a series of decisions that follow that, but I'm just going to focus on that one. Milliken said you cannot have an interdistrict remedy without an interdistrict constitutional violation. In other words, if you can't prove that you moved kids across districts, then you can't move them across districts to remedy the segregation. That essentially closed the courthouse door to much of the desegregation that could have happened, particularly in the North and West, because what you have are these smaller districts that are that tend to be much more racially homogenous because people voted with their feet. And if you don't bring those children together across district lines, there's really nobody to integrate with, because you now have these enclaves that are really racially isolated. And so that was certainly a big impediment to desegregation. And then there was a series of decisions by the court to allow districts to stop, allow district courts to release districts from desegregation orders if they had, complied in good faith with a desegregation decree and had desegregated, eliminated the vestiges of discrimination to the extent practicable. And so the problem there is that's an effort standard. Did you try? It's not, they moved away from green standard of you must have an effective desegregation plan and instead said, have you, focused on good faith and have you made a good effort to do so? And so there's a series of decisions that allow district courts to release districts from school desegregation. And because of that, you did not have a wholesale assault on school segregation in the United States. Jim Crow was around much longer than than the efforts that we had to try to dismantle segregation. And so because of that, we still have lots of roots and vestiges of school segregation, and those systems have deep roots and they replicate themselves over time. In addition to that decision, the Rodriguez decision, San Antonio Independent School District versus Rodriguez, rejected a claim that there is a federal right to education. So that decision is important because the plaintiffs there alleged that funding disparities between districts were unconstitutional and that there was a fundamental federal right to education. The court rejected that for a number of reasons. One, saying that there's not an explicit or implicit right in the Constitution that guarantees a federal right to education, but also said we don't want to upset this balance of federalism of having federal courts intervene over school districts because we recognize the importance and value of local control. Local control was one of those reasons that was given for all of those school desegregation cases that started to allow districts to be released, because the court said, look, local control can support experimentation, it can support innovation. We want to return control to local authorities. What you have to understand, though, is that local control in education is not an end of itself. It is an end that is designed to achieve certain goals, including excellence and equity in education. And oftentimes, instead, local control has been used as one of those sort of rationales that really limit the ability of federal law and policy to insist on changes that would dismantle the structural racism that lives on in the schools today. And then finally, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act really has I could have talked the whole time about that statute alone, but the drawbacks of that statute, and I'll just wrap up there, and say what to do. There to say that the mechanisms that are in the Elementary and Secondary Education Act have not been sufficiently robust to dismantle this systemic racism that is in the schools. The Title I funding formula does not emphasize the concentrated poverty that we see in many schools of color in an effective way. And so because of that, we have a federal statute that, does give some additional money to schools and children of color and children in poverty. However, it's not an effective mechanism to drive the kind of resources that are needed in those communities and schools. And so there's several things to do about that. Which we can talk about more in Q&A. One of the things that I've written extensively about is that we need to, the United States should recognize a federal right to education. And the reason for that is that many states, once Rodriguez happened, lawyers went to state court to try to litigate school funding issues. But unfortunately, what they have found and why they've returned to federal court lately is that the state courts have not been an effective venue to hold state lawmakers accountable for their neglect of equity and their favoring of whiter and wealthier interests. And so because of that, one of the ways to start to dismantle some of this structural racism is to create a federal forum to intervene in how schools are disadvantaging many children in poverty and children of color. So that is sort of one of them. We can talk further about other mechanisms, but I want to make sure we get on to other panelists. So thank you.
Oh my gosh, those are such alarming statistics, right? That 81% of parents think that there's equal educational opportunities even though there's a $23 billion gap in funding, even though 15 states don't try to make up for the gap, and even though we know that it costs more to educate poor children, right? Like that, all of those statistics combined are horribly depressing. You must have opinions about what you've given us the great background. I'm curious what attitudes you think are the foundation of it. Why would 81% think that our funding is just fine and our opportunities are just fine? There's also evidence out there that if we invest in education, we end up saving money in the long run, right? And so why is there no investment? Why do 15 states not fund it properly? And I probably have some answers, but I want to hear what you think about it. So social attitudes, I would say, about education is what I'm really asking.
Yeah, so there's a lot of causes for why we are here today. So one of them is our failure to desegregate the schools means that many people that are adults today really never learned with people who are different from themselves. And so people are very much in homogenous schools. And then research shows that the more homogenous your environment is when you're young, the more likely you are to choose a more segregated lifestyle as an adult. And the reverse is true. When you have a desegregated schooling experience, you choose a more integrated life as an adult. And so because we've lived our lives in silos, we don't tend to have these experiences that help us be exposed to people who are unlike ourselves. Another reason for that, particularly on the funding level, why don't the states respond to the research about the fact that we need to invest in children in concentrated poverty? I mean, there's a number of things. There's quite a bit of literature about suburban capture of state legislatures. The suburban interests, get met in the state house, and other interests don't. The other thing is, poor families don't have the same political leverage that wealthier families do. So wealthier, whiter families have a lot more political leverage, so they can get the state to sort of engineer the formula to their advantage. And then it's sort of, you'd have to then disrupt that system with either a lawsuit or change in the leadership to really change what's happening. And so, state houses are really not places where equity is a priority. And so because of that, you don't have the states doing a great job. And then the federal government hands out, millions of dollars, actually billions, but doesn't condition that money on things that would demand that states act differently. So the conditions we have on this money we hand out are inadequate, and the states won't do it on their own. So we have this entire breakdown at the federal, state, and local level of nobody demanding that we do the right thing by children. And so because of that, we keep, underinvesting in generations of children.
Thank you very much, Professor Robinson. That was depressing. Professor Moran, I'll hand it over to you.
Great. So first of all, I wanted to thank Melia Cerato and the Loyola Law Review for inviting me to be here today. I want to build on some of the comments by the previous panelists who've described for you the existing landscape of inequality that we saw before the pandemic hit. Now, what I wanted to do is to try in my remarks both to dig a little bit deeper into those patterns of persistent inequality, take a look at how the pandemic has intensified those inequities, and then close with just a few remarks on ways that we might work with legal tools to try to address some of the harms to learning that have occurred both before and during the pandemic. So I wanted to start off with persistent inequalities. And I want to take a look at some of the characteristics of the student body that have been markers of inequality. But as was mentioned previously, we don't want to focus exclusively on the characteristics of the student body. So I'm also going to talk briefly about characteristics of the schools that serve different students, building on some of Professor Robinson's observations. So the first area that I wanted to touch on is segregation. As Professor Robinson mentioned, we have tried to dismantle desegregation, but with very little success. And I think you can get a sense of just how continuous the segregation is, how deep it is from these statistics, which show, for example, that Black students are over 5 times as likely as white students to attend a school with a majority student body of color. So we see that for Black students. We also see for Latinx students intensifying patterns of racial and ethnic segregation. Latinx students today are less likely to attend a school with a substantial number of white students than they were previously, as a recent study by Bruce Fuller shows. Now, sometimes when people see the data on Latinx students, they say, well, of course they're more segregated than before because the population has grown so dramatically in recent decades. And that is one contributing factor to intensifying patterns of segregation, but it does not explain all of the pattern, according to Fuller and his colleagues. Now, in order to fully understand these patterns, we need to also link them up to patterns about poverty. And this really builds on Dr. Perry's remarks, because what you see here is also substantial isolation by socioeconomic status. So Black students are over twice as likely as white students to attend a school that is a majority low-income student population. But when you see the intersection of race and poverty, it really shows you in stark relief the differences. Because if you look at high poverty, predominantly student of color schools, over half of Black students will attend those schools, while under 10% of whites do. And conversely, if you look at schools that are markers of concentrated advantage with low levels of poverty, predominantly white student bodies, only a tiny fraction, 3.1% of Black students will go to a school like that, compared to 1 out of 4 white students. Now, the picture for Latinx is a little bit more complicated. You'll recall that ethnic segregation was intensifying for Latinx, but socioeconomic integration was actually declining during the same period. Now, that might seem paradoxical. How could those two things be true at the same time? Fuller offers 2 explanations. One is that during this period, Latinx population was not only growing, it was dispersing throughout the country. And as Latinx families moved to new destinations, they tended to settle in predominantly Latinx neighborhoods, regardless of their socioeconomic status. That would explain an intensifying ethnic segregation and less in the way of socioeconomic isolation. He also offers another explanation, a less happy account of the reason, and that is that during the Great Recession of 2008, Latinx lost more in the way of household wealth than any other racial or ethnic group. And this mean that middle-class Latinx were no longer able to sustain their residences in middle-class communities and relocated to less affluent communities. Again, that would intensify ethnic segregation, but we lessen socioeconomic isolation. Now I wanted to look at a couple of other factors that really haven't been mentioned so far, and these relate to characteristics of language and immigration status, and because we do have a very significant immigrant population now in the United States that we need to attend to. And what we see here are that English language learners are more likely to attend schools that are isolated by race and poverty. And they are not just majority poverty or majority student of color schools. They are over 75% or greater. So these are intensely isolated by race and poverty. And those conditions of intense isolation in turn correlate with a growing achievement gap between Latinx English language learners and white students. On immigration status, we really don't have the same kind of data for undocumented students, because many times the data are not recorded for obvious reasons of concerns about immigration enforcement. But we do know that for many undocumented students, school has seemed like a safe haven, particularly after the United States Supreme Court guaranteed a right of access to public elementary and secondary schools for the undocumented. But during the time of the Trump administration's increased enforcement of immigration laws and heightened rhetoric around immigration, many students felt unsafe at school. They were no longer sure that school was a safe haven. In a study done by John Rogers and his team at UCLA, what's important to remember that these students are often in schools isolated by race and poverty. These students actually were affected themselves if they were undocumented, but they might have citizen siblings with at least one undocumented parent also affected, and even citizen children with citizen parents who attended the same school were affected by the alteration in the learning environment and the atmosphere of inclusion and full participation. Now, I did say that I wanted to look beyond the student characteristics and take a look at the school characteristics. And I do want to build on Professor Robinson's observations about disparities in school finance. She cited the Education Trust data, which showed an $1,800 gap. The Century Foundation actually did a study that showed even more substantial gaps in funding, with schools that were serving a predominantly Black and Latinx student body having $5,000 less to spend per pupil, and schools with low income student enrollments, high levels, they had $6,700 less per pupil. That's a very substantial chunk of the average per pupil funding. Now, what was striking to me in these data was that the 10 districts with the lowest per capita student funding levels served a predominantly Latinx student body, and they were mainly located in Texas. And, Professor Robinson mentioned litigation over school finance. That litigation actually came out of Texas because of substantial disparities in school funding, and it appears that these very substantial disparities persist in the state. Now I wanted to turn to the impact of the pandemic, a topic that we haven't yet covered, because when the pandemic hit and schools closed, students went from being members of neighborhoods and communities and schools to sheltering at home. And home is also typically a segregated space. And it may be in some ways more intensely segregated than schools, neighborhoods, and communities. First of all, households tend to be racially homogeneous. And although rates of interracial marriage have increased, they still remain a rarity. So the vast majority of households will have a racially homogeneous composition, family members. Now, with respect to socioeconomic status, again, there is isolation. And you might say, well, but of course there is, because we measure socioeconomic status by household wealth, so everyone is going to look the same. To avoid that problem, I looked at data on educational attainment in the household. And what you really see are strong patterns, not only of racial endogamy, but educational endogamy. So if you are a high school dropout, you will typically, overwhelmingly, marry someone else who is a high school dropout or at most has a high school diploma. But if you're a college graduate, you will overwhelmingly marry someone who has a bachelor's degree or higher. What that actually means is that when you have a two-wage earner household, for example, the buffers against adversity are much lower in households with two people who didn't finish high school or just got a high school diploma, because each of them is far more likely to be out of work. So you really see that they are much more likely to be suffering during downward economic cycles because they don't have the kind of educational diversity in the household that would buffer them. The other thing we can see are patterns of linguistic isolation in the household. So very often you will see that families report that they speak a language other than English. And in less affluent households, they typically are not fluent in English. So these are not necessarily bilingual households. They tend to look more like a monolingual, non-English speaking household. And undocumented children or citizen children with an undocumented parent, at least one, also face isolation in their home by poverty and language. So going to home, staying home does not necessarily mitigate the impact of segregation. The other thing that we saw during the pandemic were very uneven effects on households in terms of both in the terms of learning access. So what we saw here is that there were significant disparities in the likelihood of participating in remote learning based on race and ethnicity, socioeconomic status, English language fluency, and undocumented status. Now, with undocumented status, I want to say we don't have the same quality data, but we do have anecdotal reports that undocumented parents were afraid to go and get devices or free internet access because they had to turn over personal information that they feared would be shared with immigration authorities. But in general, we see disparate patterns of access. The other thing that we see is because households concentrate various forms of disadvantage, we saw that certain students, in particular Black and Latinx students, faced multiple barriers to online learning, and that Latinx students on average faced the largest number of obstacles to getting access to and benefiting from remote learning. Now, I wanted to just briefly touch on the barriers to access that we saw during the pandemic. And the one that really got the most press was the digital divide, because of differences in access to devices like computers, iPads, even cell phones, as well as differential access to internet connectivity by race, ethnicity, and poverty. But those were not the only sources of barriers to learning during the pandemic, because what we also saw were differential rates of household insecurity. So what we found were there were differences in unemployment rates during the pandemic, with Latinx and Black households facing the highest unemployment rates. And also what we saw was that those forms of insecurity translated, for example, into food insecurity. And it is astonishing to see that in May and early June, that such a significant proportion of households reported that they had run out of food and didn't have any resources to buy more. And what you'll also notice here is that the Latinx statistic, nearly half, is actually, I think, reflective of the fact that many of the forms of COVID relief that we offered were not available to any family with an undocumented parent, one undocumented parent. So Latinx parents had fewer resources to cope with adversity. The final area, which is also important, is that coronavirus came to people's homes at different rates. And so if you were in a Black or Latinx household, you were more likely to have a member of your family infected with coronavirus, hospitalized due to coronavirus, and even gone forever as a result of the coronavirus. And that disrupted the financial and psychological integrity of these families. There was a considerable amount of trauma around the impact of the disease. Now I wanted to turn to the impact of the pandemic on the schools, because you'll recall I looked at student characteristics and school characteristics. Those gaps in per capita funding actually correlated with differential levels of preparedness to address the impact of the pandemic. So schools that didn't have as much per capita funding were not as able to provide devices and internet access. And also, and it's very reminiscent of people who couldn't get bank loans because they didn't have relationships with the banks. These schools that had fewer resources also didn't have long-standing relationships with vendors, so they weren't as able to compete in the market. And at the time the pandemic hit, there was intense competition for these devices because everybody needed them. Also, these school districts had to cope with other challenges like getting meals to students who needed free and reduced price lunches, or delivering instruction in multiple languages because they had a robust population of English language learners. And so what we saw as a result of these differences were that schools varied dramatically in how long it took to create an online learning program, how many hours of instruction were available, what topics were covered, whether you covered new material, whether you had one-on-one access to your teacher, and also whether you bothered to monitor attendance and see if students were actually logging in for the course material. This, of course, has translated into differential learning losses. We are at a little bit of a disadvantage because testing hasn't necessarily been taking place during the pandemic, but there were projections of learning losses. And as you can see here, based on a McKinsey report, which assumed that schools would reopen in January 2021, something that we know didn't happen, the typical student was going to suffer 7 months of learning losses, over half a year, but a Black student would suffer nearly a year's worth, a Latinx student 3/4 of a year's worth, and low-income students were going to lose over a year of learning. And so these are very dramatic setbacks for students as a result of the school closures, which continue. Now, I wanted to turn to what can we do about all of this? What tools do we have at our disposal to address the kinds of harms that we've just discussed? And most of the right to education lawsuits, which Professor Robinson alluded to in her remarks, focus on inputs and outputs. And so the inputs are those disparities in instructional time and quality and one-on-one access to teachers that I just mentioned. And the disparities in outputs relate to learning losses, differential learning losses. Now, what's interesting is that a couple of suits have already been filed here in my home state of California, one against Los Angeles Unified School District, the other against the state of California. And they have cited precisely these kinds of factors. But what's really interesting is that their access to disparities in input seems to be much better than to the impact on outputs, because they have learning plans that the state required, as well as side agreements with teachers unions that set out with considerable specificity what the inputs look like. But because of the lack of testing, they don't necessarily have a strong picture of the learning losses that occurred in particular districts. Now, in the lawsuits in California, they are being brought under the state constitution and our state right to education. As Professor Robinson mentioned, the federal jurisdictions don't provide much in the way of protection of a right to education because they require an absolute deprivation of education. What's interesting is the court has never found an absolute deprivation, but we are discovering during the pandemic that there are students who had no access to learning for a very substantial period of time. And one question is, would the court think of that as an absolute deprivation of education, one worthy of federal intervention under the Equal Protection Clause? The California lawsuits don't rely on a theory of absolute deprivation because they're state suits, but it's interesting because they actually mention absolute deprivation in the state to strengthen their claims under the state approaches of adequacy and equality. And so under the adequacy claim, they are arguing that all of those differences in input denied students a basic education that they need to participate in the workforce and in our democratic process. And that the deprivations are likely to lead students to fail to meet state standards in various content areas. They also are arguing that there was unequal access to education. So not just that you failed to meet the minimum, but there are disparities based on things like race and ethnicity that have denied students an equal educational opportunity and the ability to stand toe-to-toe with their privileged peers in districts that had more resources and delivered more robust remote instruction. Because California has had both kinds of claims existing side by side, the distinctions that are drawn are not dramatic in the evidence that's offered and the claims that are made for relief based on whether it was inadequate or unequal. But I do think it's very interesting to see these cases playing out in California. We don't yet have any answers because they haven't been processed yet. But I think that these right to education cases will test the boundaries of the entitlements under state and federal law. So in closing, what I wanted to say is that what we've heard today is that there are substantial inequalities that existed before the pandemic. The pandemic has intensified those inequalities, but it has also caused us to scrutinize them with renewed interest. And that creates an opportunity to revisit what those opportunities for education should look like. And here I would like to close with a quote from Langston Hughes that captures that spirit. Let America be America again. Let it be the dream it used to be, even if America never was America to me. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Professor Moran. I love the glimmer of hope you give us at the end. That's fantastic. And it's fascinating to think that those equal protection cases might be useful, that are based exclusively on COVID, may be useful to crack the door open a little bit for a broader purpose. I'm going to actually ask a question specifically to you that was asked by our Professor Medina about the digital divide. And her question is, wow, that seems so easy to fix at the time. Free computers, free internet access. It was the low-hanging fruit. Do you have any reason why that might not have been sorted out?
Well, first of all, there were districts that ordered, but they were backlogged on the orders because everybody in the wake of the pandemic, as the school closures happened, was trying to get devices. So the market kind of had a supply issue. And that was one reason. Also, some school districts didn't have the resources to make these purchases immediately. They also had to enter into negotiations with internet service providers, which because it was very expensive. And so they're trying to get either free or discounted access. In the meantime, there were schools that were kind of entrepreneurial. So they took their school buses and made them into Wi-Fi hotspots, parked them in the parking lots of places and so forth. So, you know, all kinds of ingenuity, but really a lot of adversity. Also, there were difficulties with distribution, even when you address the supply issues. So with distribution, you found that some parents were working and they couldn't come to pick up the devices during the appointed times. Some were afraid to come in because they had immigration issues. And so there were issues along those lines. The other area that I want to mention is that some of the teachers were not prepared. So you had teachers who had never taught online. And by the way, I should add, I was one of them at higher education level, but you know, they had teachers in K through 12 who had never taught online, and they needed to actually figure out how to do it and get their own devices and make sure their Wi-Fi was good enough and all the rest of it. And so there was also some stickiness in just terms of making the shift to the online platform for the teachers.
Mm-hmm. Thank you all so much. You've given us a lot to think about. There, as in any education law and policy discussion, there's just too much to unpack at one time. But I want to ask so many questions, but I need to defer to all the people that have asked excellent questions. Let me start off with one that's great, because most of the audience here is really missing the fact that we had Mardi Gras, and there's a Mardi Gras related question. So I'm going to bring that up. This sort of lack of diversity in schools is absolutely in our face when we go to a normal Mardi Gras, because all the bands, the school bands, they're basically 100% segregated. And so we see it. Andre's smiling, he knows. And the question is, wow, it's so apparent and obvious in our face. Is there any housing policies? We'll talk about maybe education policies for integrating school, but is there any housing policies that may work in this respect to get our schools integrated? And we'll talk about the importance of that as well. I'm just going to open that up to anyone on the panel.
Well, you know, for me, this is why when you talk about education, you really have to have an expansive conversation. Single family housing zoning ordinances are still an impediment to integration because they essentially limit the kind of homes that can be in a community and not necessarily meet the demand that families need in terms of multifamily housing units. So you have that. And I've always said that there is actually a place for charter schools in when it comes to integration, because they're not necessarily wedded to school zones, you don't necessarily have to. You can actually create a scenario where the willing are going to schools across district lines and going into that school. And so instead of sort of using charters as a way to dismantle current like schools within a zone, they should be using them in a way to do things that traditional schools and school zones can't do. So those are just a couple of this immediate thoughts, but in general, it's so much harder to change residential patterns. And that's why it's also hard to change these things in schools, but there are new policy efforts on the horizon in the housing space that can encourage integration.
Yeah, so I'll just build on that briefly to say that I think what's important to understand for housing policy as well as school policy is we have to engage at the federal, state, and local level, because all three of those levels engaged to get us to this moment. Like, systemic racism didn't happen. No one level of government could have instituted the widespread segregation that we have. And so we need to make sure that we are not only strengthening, the Fair Housing Act, but also looking at state laws and incentives that can help to integrate housing, break up concentrated poverty. I just think, so often we have these like piecemeal approaches to these massive problems, but yet those who have sought to discriminate and engage in, impose white supremacy on a variety of different institutions took every opportunity and tool to do that. Like, they didn't say like, okay, let's have the federal government address this. No, the feds were engaged in redlining. The states were complicit with zoning, and local realtors stepped in. Like, we had everyone involved. And I just think we don't think big enough about having all levels of government involved in the solution. We tend in schools to say, okay, let's open a charter school. Let's do this. It's these one-offs, but it's not systematic and comprehensive. And I think that's how we have to think about remedies. And that's harder, right? It's harder to think about comprehensive, but I think it's the only way to move the ball in a real way. Otherwise, we're just tinkering at the margins.
I would just add that I think, it is certainly true that residential segregation is probably a tough area to change, but we've also made it difficult to change patterns of school segregation because the United States Supreme Court said that you can't factor in race in individual student assignments, even as part of a voluntary plan adopted by local school boards, because it's an impermissible consideration of race. And so as a result, one of the key tools that might be used, even with political support, right, voluntary integration plans is no longer available. You have to use more indirect kinds of racial factors like drawing school boundaries and school siting and so forth. But the socioeconomic plans that have been pursued as an alternative are relatively rarely used, and they don't tend to be as effective in racial and ethnic integration. And so they really haven't been the kind of solution that people thought they might be. So really, it isn't just that we leave these entrenched and people don't notice. It's also that certain tools, when people did notice, were taken away from them.
That's exactly right. And both Kimberly and Rachel make this point, but there was this sort of concert of federal, state, local effort. I mean, it's like this bundle of discrimination, and that, was working hard to make what we see happen today. And so it's really going to take us going at those individual strands of that bundle and look for tools in each of those areas, because the tools that we could use to improve funding and produce integration, they've been taken away. And so we need new tools. And it's just, but what's interesting about this debate around schools, I've heard so many people say, well, doing that is too hard. let's just figure out a way to make teachers better, or make students better. And, you know, that's just fraught with all kind of problems. I mean, it's a racist notion in itself to say, if we can only fix students, or we can fix the school board, or we can fix the teachers. That's part of that whole racist trope that there's something wrong with Black teachers. There's something wrong with Black districts, and not in abdicating responsibility to deal with these structural issues. So, I mean, we hear this all the time, that it's too hard. We can't do that. But yes, we can. The same way we created systems to support these segregated, underfunded schools, we can replace them with anti-racist policies that deliver the kind of results we want.
Yeah, definitely. The word I've been using lately is just relentless. We have to be relentless. And because segregationists, white supremacists, they're relentless. Like, they just don't give up. They just don't stop. And so we can't be, you know, the Supreme Court's desegregation cases, there's this fatigue. We've been at, you know, you start reading Missouri versus Jenkins, it's like 18 years later. 18 years, you just got started. Like, you just started. And the court is starting that way to say, like, we've been at this a long time. We have barely started. And so it's important, you know, Justice Ginsburg points that out. But unfortunately, most of the public seems to think like, oh my gosh, yeah, we worked on school desegregation a long time. No, we didn't. We didn't. And so we just have to be relentless. Relentless. That is the word of the times for me lately in addressing these issues. Because I mean, those seeking to undermine equality and advance systemic racism are relentless. And if we aren't, shame on us.
I actually wanted to ask a question, because when I saw the map that you put up, Dr. Perry, with the majority Black metropolitan cities, they were so heavily still concentrated in the South. And Charles Blow wrote a book recently on The Devil We Know. And he makes a very different argument, which is that we should, you know, Blacks should reverse the Great Migration, return to the South, create enclaves of Black political power and autonomy to leverage their kind of state regional influence to have a national impact. And it's such a different model. And I just wondered what you think about that, because instead of saying, you know, fix this, fix that, you know, something's wrong with people, he says, no, the problem is we've been too dispersed, we've been disempowered, and we need to concentrate our influence.
Well, there's a lot of truth in that. You can take advantage of demographics in politically speaking, and there is a conversation about power that we should be having. However, with that said, you know, there are enough people in place currently, and there's always been, like, there's never been a time when the majority of Black Americans did not live in the South, right? And we've always had these places, and but now we're starting to see, after generations of work and effort, because this, you know, we tend to only look at like the civil rights movement as one thing, or the Black Lives Matter movement is one. I mean, there's been an ongoing effort to gain power, and we're starting to realize that in the South. I mean, you started to see that even before Georgia turned blue. It was Alabama in the special election. Doug Jones won it largely because of Birmingham, Mobile, and Montgomery, and largely because Black women mobilizing. And let's be clear, in Louisiana, New Orleans, Baton Rouge, Shreveport, Black mayors there, Black power there. So we've always had sort of demographics on our side, but I do think that people are starting to exercise power in a different way. So we don't need to have another great migration. I mean, some things are already happening. We don't need it, but there is a lot of truth in that. this is a power conversation. We're not going to compel those 70-something million people who voted for Donald Trump. I mean, I'm going to be clear that racism is a bad thing, or bad enough that it should change the way we teach, change the way we live, change the way we work. A lot of folks aren't buying that. So we're going to have to make people accept that. And that comes through mobilizing, organizing, doing what we did during this this past election to really put a spotlight on the harms of structural racism. But, you know, as Kimberly said, folks are relentless. And so, and I think, not to belabor this point, but there is a sort of romanticization of sort of the "I have a dream" speech of we're going to we all really want to walk hand in hand and go to school together. That is just not true. It's noble and as good as that idea is, people don't believe in it. And so then it becomes, we're just going to have to do the work in making policy work for those who understand the power of multiculturalism, the power of diversity, the power of togetherness, and the cost racism is having on our lives. And so for me, it is a power conversation, but we don't need to move back down south. We're already there. It's all, I mean, the demographics are already there.
I love the have to be relentless. It always begs the question of relentless at what? It's been really hard for progressives to sort of get together and agree. We have all these different education reform sort of movements, accountability, socioeconomic integration, equalized funding, choice through charter schools and vouchers. Like, we don't seem to have much staying power on any of these reforms. But when we say be relentless, and I'm sorry, the progressives will often play one against the other and say, well, if we focus on funding, then that'll take away our attention from integration, or vice versa. Like, if we focus on integration, then we're just going to give up on equalized funding. So when we say relentless, I'm curious, sort of, is there a policy that you would pursue, or is it a much broader based look? And that's for anybody.
Yeah, so I think, you know, I do think that you have to fix the funding problems to really move forward on education reform and educational equity. So, you know, equity is a term in education that was a focus when ESEA was passed. You know, driving resources to low-income children was the focus. And then we shifted the focus at the federal level to sort of just helping everyone. Like we broadened it to say, let's put everyone under this new umbrella of standards accountability. And what happened is we diluted the effectiveness. The formula was sort of not well designed at the start, because to get buy-in, everyone needed a piece of the pie. So to get it through, you had to design a formula that said, well, everyone gets some of the Title I money, right? And so the problem is that it's never been designed well. But my point is, like, in terms of our aim, we do have to be clear. If you're going to be relentless, you have to be clear, at least on the aim. There may be many paths to get there, but this idea of equity and driving resources that would dismantle concentrated poverty, dismantle systemic racism, that's the sort of relentless nature I'm talking about. And sort of getting to that at all levels of government is really the aim that I was talking about. So there's ways to do that at the federal level, the state level, and the local level. Those policies are often different. You know, conditions on funding at the federal level is different from, you know, insisting that states re-engineer their funding formulas in ways that, redistribute resources, you know, are different from what localities can do in terms of focusing on regionalism and bringing people together. So they're actually quite disparate policies depending on which level of government you're speaking of, which is part of what makes it so complicated, right? We're not just trying to get one thing done. There's many obstacles and thus many campaigns that have to be waged.
I would say, for me, part of what is a kind of an issue is education is both a private and a public good. And so we want to make sure that from the standpoint of the private good, that students have what I called in a book that's edited by Professor Robinson on a federal right to education, an opportunity to compete, to vie with their peers meaningfully for jobs and for voice in the political process. Now, that is an incomplete account, but it does acknowledge it's a private good and a positional good. However, it is also a public good. And it was already mentioned that it was the common school and the great equalizer, but the idea of the common school was also that in a democracy, people from different walks of life would come together, they would understand one another, they would learn to speak with one another, they would learn to have dialogues about their shared fate and collective purpose together. And that just does not happen in the way that our schools are currently structured. And we are paying a price for that, because we are seeing polarization in our body politic, an inability to communicate with others who think differently. And that is damaging our democratic dialogue.
Yep.
And we aren't even trying to fix it through civics instruction, because teachers are afraid to insert themselves into polarized discourses. So I want to make sure when we think about being relentless, that we think about it not only from the standpoint of that private positional good that education represents, which is tremendously important for issues of inequality, but also think about it from the standpoint of our democratic public good, right? And the court has recognized that. In Plyler, it said it would do an injury to our democratic fabric to exclude the undocumented. And when you look at the experience that undocumented have in K through 12, that is where they become attached to America. They say the Pledge of Allegiance, they know the national anthem, they believe that they are Americans. And you gave the statistics on Latinx being satisfied with their schools. Latinx are the most optimistic subgroup in America. They believe that the future is going to be bright, and the less time they've spent in America, the more they believe it. So schools can play a very important role in political socialization, and we shouldn't forget that in all of the discussion of inequities that affect private opportunities or individual opportunities.
I will add that I don't think we have to, well, I know we don't have to fund education in the manner in which we do. We can learn a lot from healthcare, in which the money essentially goes into a centralized pot, and the state can then determine how to distribute those funds. I really think we need to go into that direction. I mean, we like the current localized nature of financing in K-12 education really keeps us in this perpetual state of how can we fill a gap when we don't necessarily have to fund education in the manner in which we do. There's only so much tinkering with these formulas you can do. I mean, in addition, I'm going to go with a curricular issue. It was mentioned earlier, and I don't think we made the point big enough. One of the reasons why we are stalling is because people are not getting a good education. They're not understanding redlining. They don't know about segregation. They don't know about these things. So when they see disparities, they say, well, that's because of individual issues. That's because of their fault. They need to work harder. That's not the it's on them. And so we really do need to have an education that is really teaches America about the history of slavery, segregation, and also, and Rachel brought this up, civics education is so important to the way we live, and it's been devalued over time with this overemphasis, in my opinion, on reading and writing and arithmetic. And we've essentially removed something that's central to how we live. I mean, and even to the point, like I talk a lot about choice. When you learn civics, you're also learning how to interact with your elected officials in your district who live down the street from you. And choice kind of blows up that time-space continuum thing. And we really do need to emphasize civic education. I mean, so much we've sort of taken out the community from school. We've almost made them like banks where you go in, you supposedly get an education, and it supposedly prepares you for higher education, you move on. No, education is supposed to teach us how to live, how to work together. I mean, in a very basic way. I mean, Dewey said it best: education is not preparation for life. Education is life itself. And civics is probably the purest way to get at that. We're learning not only about the branches of government, it's more about how to work and play and live together and reinforce the values that on paper, in terms of a democracy, we're supposed to uplift. So I think there's certainly a financing policy issue at play, but there is an educational component of this, and it's in learning history, American history for what it was, and civics education. It has to be a bigger part of the discussion.
All right, we've got 5 minutes left. I love how the last group ended with the, if you have a magic wand, what would you use it for? I'm gonna actually insert mine. I'm gonna steal Erwin Chemerinsky's. He waved his magic wand a while ago and thought of like the best education system he could come up with if the Constitution didn't exist, which is outlaw private education. We need everyone invested in public education. Of course, we can't do that. Eliminate local funding of education. This is what Dr. Perry's talking about. Create real equitable funding that is statewide, if not even nationwide, which is what Professor Roberts is talking about. And then sort of compel integrated schools, because if we don't learn together, we'll never learn to live together. So I'm going to steal someone else's magic wand. That's what I would wave and do. I'd love to hear from each of you.
Well, I'll because you already said it. I really do want to take the local aspect of the school funding away, out of it, and create a more centralized budgeting process for me. I mean, if I could wave a magic wand, I would. I mean, this sounds crazy, but I would say that Sherman's March to the Sea and would have been followed up properly with 40 acres and a mule. It would have, instead of the retrenchment from Reconstruction, I think we were on the right path. And if I could wave a magic wand and go back in time, I would say, hey, let's really nip this, the hatred in the bud. I mean, it's really saying we need to reconstruct the way we deliver not just education, but all the services people need in order to survive.
Look, if we get magic wands, we get time travel too.
That's yeah, there you go.
Professor Moran?
Well, I guess for me, going back to my comments about education as both a private and a public good, if I had a magic wand from the private good standpoint, I would want to find ways to ensure that each student is able to develop his or her particular skills, gifts. You know, I think we've developed a very market-oriented, narrow notion of excellence that excludes a lot of children, regardless of the characteristics of their schools. Children whose major sort of area of excellence is going to be their artistic achievement, for example. And we don't really have ways right now of fully including them, I think. So one is I would like to broaden our notions of excellence to be more inclusive of the range of gifts that children bring to the schools. Secondly, obviously, it's important to put resources behind that broadened notion of excellence. But finally, the country is facing its demographic kind of rendezvous with its demographic destiny. We are going to see dramatic transformations in the American population. And I would like to be the schools to be the place where we start allowing children to understand themselves in a new world, one that is both demographically transformed domestically, but also we are going to be in a different place globally, I think, in terms of our spot in the world. And I don't think we've had either of those conversations very well at the adult level. So maybe we need to help children to start to have the kinds of interactions that prepare them for better conversations around those issues. That would require some degree of integration of the schools. But I think it would also require some curriculum that doesn't focus on skills that are just sort of reading and writing and arithmetic, but also skills of interpersonal interaction. You know, Arlie Hochschild went to the South to talk to people who started the Tea Party, and she describes the need for empathy bridges, so you can better understand what other people are feeling. And we just don't do that kind of soft skills stuff in the schools, maybe in the way that we need to have hard conversations.
Excellent, thank you, Professor Robinson.
So there's already some great ideas on the table. You'd only added time travel to the so that was
hey, we got
a wand and time travel and a wand. So that's great. So I'm gonna just focus on the wand and probably set aside the time travel a bit. But I do think one, I think that we need to re-engineer the federal-state relationship in ways that would have the federal government be a true partner in education. It's on the sidelines now, and we're not going to get to greater equity and excellence without greater federal investment. And that is not about writing a check only. It is about setting national and federal priorities for our schools that include things like, some of the things that my co-panelists mentioned, increasing our focus on civic education, teaching history accurately to increase understanding. So I do think we need to re-engineer those things. I also think that we need to think about how we're going to dismantle systemic racism at every level. So I think that we have to look at how localities, states, and the federal government contributed to it, and then sort of reverse engineer, like figure out how to dismantle it and what role the federal, state, and local governments must play in that. Because it lives not just in housing policy and school policy, it lives in our classrooms in curriculum that gives, a short amount of time to slavery and a long time to Jamestown, right? It lives in just the idea, teaching children that Brown versus Board of Education desegregated the schools. It's like, shouldn't be telling kids that anymore, right? You should explain that actually what happened is, and explain the narrative, because then when you have a more accurate understanding of history, then you have a more accurate understanding of the work that we have before us. And so I think that's important. And then I think finally, we do need to have a conversation around a shared vision of what our schools should look like. What is our ultimate goal? What is excellence? What is equity? What is high quality? And I think we need to have those conversations in ways that are honest about, what we're prioritizing, what we value, that embrace the demographic changes that Professor Moran talked about, and then move us toward a reality that does enable each child to reach their full potential. That is what every parent wants, but it's not just about people investing in their kids. We need to just have this sense of shared destiny such that we are willing to invest in other people's children and willing to insist on the policies that will help other people's children to achieve their highest potential. And in that, we all win. And so I think that is what we've lost, that sense of shared destiny and community. And I think we need to return to that as we reshape and re-engineer the schools.
Oh, that's outstanding. I love what you're going to do with your wand. The Loyola Law Review will send you each a magic wand. But in order, I'm going to wrap it up. First of all, by saying huge apologies to everyone who had a lot of questions in the Q&A. There's just no way to get to them all, and I'm really sorry about that. I also want to wrap up with just such gratitude to the law review for getting the all-star panel and for the three of you showing. I mean, this is my best Friday in a long time. I really appreciate it. I will now turn it over to Malia.
And thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.